All righty. Good morning, everybody. I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies here at AEI. A pleasure to have you with us today for a conversation with Senator Lamar Alexander on ESSA and the rise and fall of the National School Board. We're going to ask that after the Senator gives his remarks, takes a couple questions, that you stay seated. We've got to get him out the door. He needs to get back to the Hill at 9 o'clock sharp. But for your pleasure, for your edification and pleasure, we have a panel which will discuss the larger question of the ESSA with several contributors from Max Eden and my new book, Every Student Succeeds Act, which will start immediately upon the Senator's departure. Now look, I am honored, and it's an honor and pleasure to introduce Senator Alexander today. He doesn't need much of an introduction in this room, so just excuse me for one moment, indulge me while I do. Let's keep in mind that he has been at the forefront of American education improvement for, really since the Reagan era, first elected as governor of Tennessee before President Reagan came to office. He has championed educational improvement as the governor, as president of the University of Tennessee, as U.S. Secretary of Education, as senator, and now as chair of the Senate Help Committee. I think it's no exaggeration to say that Senator Alexander is the single most influential individual when it comes to the shape of federal education policy today. He is the architect of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which I think by any account is certainly the most substantial effort to revamp K-12 since No Child Left Behind, and the most significant effort to refashion Washington's role in K-12 education, probably since ESSA was first enacted in 1965. In addition, one of the things that I think makes me so heartened by the Senator's leadership is he is also a champion of old-fashioned civility. He's someone who has steadfastly argued that it's important the legislative process in this nation work the way the founders intended. And he is someone who has fought to ensure that the laws under which American education operates are made actually by the legislative branch rather than by the whims of the executive branch. So with that, it's my honor and pleasure to turn the podium over to Senator Alexander. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Rick, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Congratulations to you and to Max and to all the authors of your book. It's a terrific job. I read the parts of it I agreed with, like most. Actually, I thought it was a very well-balanced summary of what we tried to do. I was thinking as you were talking, we see a lot in the news about conflict in Washington, but things that get done really don't make much news if you stop and think about it. And I was looking around our committee the other day and wondering how the hell did we ever pass this law, because there's a lot of difficult politics in schools. I remember in the 1980s, I had spent some time fighting with the National Education Association and put in place in Tennessee the first program to pay teachers more for teaching well, as part of a larger, better school effort. At the same time, Ross Perot was taking on the public schools, fixing the public schools of Texas. So I went to see Ross in the mid-'80s and said, why don't we get together and form an Americans for Better Schools? He said, nope. I said, why not? He said, I've rescued employees from Iran. I've purchased a Magna Carta, but trying to fix the public schools of Texas is the hardest, meanest, bloodiest thing I've ever tried to do, and I'm not doing it anymore. So it takes a stout heart to do what happened. I titled the remarks, I've got about 15 or 18 minutes of remarks, and I'll be glad to take your questions. I entitled it, The Rise and Fall of the National School Board. On April 16th, 2015, after 7 years of congressional efforts, 27 hearings, many hours of staff and senator work, finally a 3-day markup where 57 amendments were considered, the Senate Education Committee met for a final vote on legislation to fix No Child Left Behind. This committee represents, as I just alluded to, what is probably the most diverse array of political perspectives in the Senate. I mean, looking around the room, we have Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Rand Paul, Tim Scott, 22 senators. And here we are about to vote on education legislation on which 2 Congresses had failed to reach bipartisan agreement. There were alligators lurking in every inch of the swamp on this bill. 22 senators, as different as could be. The vote started with Senator Murray and it ended with me. And in the end, the clerk read the vote. I have 22 ayes, 0 nays, he said. It was a dramatic moment, an emotional moment for me. The room erupted in applause. Even the senators were applauding ourselves. So how did we get to that moment where 22 senators of every political stripe agreed that the best way to educate a child in a classroom was to restore decisions about what to do about test results to their teacher and their school district with fewer orders from Washington, D.C.? I'd like to talk a little bit about the law in the context of my time in public life, which now runs to about 4 decades. Specifically the rise and fall of what I would call the National School Board. Almost everyone agrees that elementary and secondary education is a national issue. It involves 50 million students, more than 3 million teachers, 100,000 public schools, the future of our country. The more complicated question is, what is the federal role? National and federal are not the same, in my opinion. A national issue is an issue of urgent concern for the whole country. A federal issue is something Washington is in the best position to solve. I was elected governor in 1978, a year before Congress created the U.S. Department of Education. That action by Congress suggested there should be more of a federal role in addressing this national issue. A Nation at Risk was published in 1983. It said, if an unfriendly foreign power attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, we have allowed this to happen to ourselves. To me, that didn't necessarily suggest more of a federal response. My own view was that the quality of a child's education depends mostly upon the involvement of the child's parents, the classroom teacher, and the community. It's very difficult, I think, to improve a child's education from a distance. I felt so strongly about that in my early days as governor. In the early 80s, I made an appointment and came to Washington and met with President Reagan in the Oval Office. I proposed to him a grand swap, Medicaid for K through 12 education. The federal government would take over 100% of Medicaid, the federal health care program, which is mainly for low-income Americans, and which the federal government pays about 60% of, and the federal and states pay about 40%, so it's a two-headed monster. And the states would assume all the responsibility for the nation's 100,000 public schools. So Medicaid for K through 12 education. President Reagan liked the idea. He actually proposed a version of it in his 1982 State of the Union address, but it didn't go anywhere. My reasoning was that the national concern about better schools would be best solved if the spotlight were on those who were really accountable for the results, the classroom teachers and the community. And I wasn't the only one who thought that. Governors during the 1980s got very busy addressing the concerns of a nation at risk. Dick Riley, Bob Graham, Bill Clinton, and I were all elected the same day in 1978 to adjoining or nearby states. And while we weren't of the same party, we worked together on the same issues and did many of the same things to try to improve education in our state. When I was chairman of the National Governors Association in 85, 86, and Bill Clinton was vice chair, we focused the governor's attention for a full year on one subject, education, and produced a report called Time for Results, challenging states to improve. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush convened all the governors in Charlottesville, and they created national education goals with an emphasis on math, science, English, history, and geography, and the governors set out trying to reach those goals, including working together, identify standards and tests, and expanding school choice. In 1991, when I became President Bush's education secretary, we created America 2000 to accelerate progress toward those goals, but we did it state by state, community by community. Colorado 2000, New Mexico 2000, California 2000. We supported start from scratch schools. We called them New American schools. They were really the first kind of charter schools. We supported higher standards and better tests, but they're all voluntary, not imposed from Washington. In 1992, at my recommendation, President Bush issued a veto threat on the proposed Elementary and Secondary Education Act because it sought to impose Washington standards for resources in public schools. I wrote the president at the time that would, quote, constitute at least the beginning of a national school board that can make day-to-day school decisions on curriculum, discipline, teacher training, textbooks, and classroom materials. A federal recipe book dictating how to operate a local school board does not make schools better. That was 25 years ago. Then over 2 years, Congress passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and Goals 2000. They turned America 2000 into Goals 2000, establishing what I would call the beginnings of a national school board in federal law. For the first time, requiring states accepting federal funds to adopt academic standards and to test students in 3 grades. Then in 2002, George W. Bush signed No Child Left Behind, which in my view would have been more appropriate for a state education law. We all know about its federal mandates, higher qualified teachers, adequate yearly progress. Then in 2009, President Obama's administration used Race to the Top to provide powerful financial incentives to meet federal standards and actions. Congress's failure to act on reauthorizing No Child Left Behind made the law unworkable. Secretary Duncan said in 2011 that more than 80% of the public schools would soon be deemed legal failures. And Duncan used states' need for waivers from the law as an opportunity to require states to do a whole number of things, including new standards, teacher evaluations based on student test scores, federally prescribed strategies for turning around low-performing schools. With these waivers came, in my opinion, the zenith of the National School Board. And that led Congress to efforts to fix No Child Left Behind, first in 2011, then 2013, and finally successfully in 2015. By then, some of the same people who thought it was a good idea in 1979 to create the U.S. Department of Education had changed their tune just a little bit. So we started heading in the opposite direction, reversing the trend toward a national school board and restoring responsibilities to states, communities, and classroom teachers. As Newsweek said, this was the education law that everybody wanted fixed. There was also a consensus on how to fix it. Continue the law's important measurements of academic progress of students, but restore to states what to do about that progress. I started out thinking we should get rid of the 17 federally required tests because of my aversion to Washington control. But over time, I listened to those in classrooms and those in the states, and I saw that the tests themselves, those tests, weren't the problem, that they were actually helpful. And what needed to be changed was who was in charge of doing something about the tests. So there was a convergence of forces to propel us across the finish line. Governors, teachers, chief state school officers, local school boards, a coalition you rarely see. The bill wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for Senator Patty Murray and Democrats in the Senate who demonstrated a commitment to reach results on very major differences of opinion. For example, I withheld my Scholarship for Kids voucher bill in committee because I knew if it got adopted in committee, it might keep the bill from getting to the floor. Senator Franken did the same thing with his discrimination amendment. Senator Isaacson and Senator Murray worked together on a difficult compromise on early childhood education. As a result, today we're firmly on track in the opposite direction from a national school board. Schools are still a national issue, but there's a consensus that the issue is not to be resolved from Washington. I supported overturning the Obama administration's accountability regulation, first because I thought the Education Department was acting as if it were the Congress. The regulation violated the law in at least 7 places and exceeded its authority in 16 more. And second, because I thought that the regulation didn't reflect the bipartisan consensus to reverse the National School Board. Today's law does include more of a federal role than existed 20 years ago. Senator Murray calls them federal guardrails, such as the requirement that students be tested annually in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school, that states report how students in each school perform overall and now by subgroup, and that states identify to take evidence-based steps to improve their lowest performing 5% of the schools. but the law still gives states broad discretion in how they design their accountability system within those guardrails. Federalists do not believe in states' rights because we think states can always be counted on to get it right. For example, right now Maryland, for the state legislature and state board of education are debating how much test results should factor into their accountability system. I understand the board members' concerns that the Assembly's approach will interfere with the board's effort to hold its schools to a higher standard. I might agree with the board, but my goal with this law was to return that debate and those decisions right where they are, to the Maryland State Assembly in Annapolis. They should decide how much test results should factor into their accountability system. Because what we learned from the Common Core debate was that federal involvement in these issues can become counterproductive. Because states are moving along fairly rapidly toward adopting that curriculum, but the opposition to Common Core really exploded once everybody got the idea that Washington was making people do it. The Every Student Succeeds Act was crystal clear that states now make those decisions about academic standards, including whether or not to continue to use Common Core. I saw it as governor of Tennessee when we put in our state evaluation system of teachers. That's hard to do. We fought over it for a couple of years. But when I got to Washington, I wasn't in favor of imposing that system on everybody because it would produce, I thought, a massive negative reaction from the very people you need to buy into the system, and I think we saw that with the teacher evaluation requirements and the waivers to No Child Left Behind. I'm a strong supporter of giving low-income kids choices of schools, but I'm not a supporter of mandates from Washington making people do it. So, in conclusion, the lesson of the last 40 years is that the National School Board is inappropriate. First, because a small federal Department of Education filled with well-meaning people simply doesn't have the capacity to evaluate teachers, rate schools, set standards, and approve tests in 100,000 schools in 50 states. Second, we've learned, especially with the Common Core debate and teacher evaluation debate, that Washington involvement can be counterproductive and can create a backlash among those who would probably do the same thing if left alone. Third, ingrained in our big, complicated country from its beginning has been a strong preference for local control of schools and a strong skepticism that anyone at a great distance can improve on decisions made by those closest to the children. So for my 40 years in public life, I've seen the rise of the National School Board and its fall. There is today more federal control of schools than there was 40 years ago. But the new law and the consensus that supported it make it clear that the federal role should be mostly limited to making us aware of how children are performing, and the responsibility for deciding what to do about that performance belongs to school boards, communities, and classroom teachers. We should be excited about this. In his chapter in Rick Hess's and Max Eden's new book, Marty West writes that the last time the nation reduced federal involvement in local schools was in 1982, and that unleashed an innovation in the states. My hope is that the same thing will happen now. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We have time for a few questions. Let me remind folks that at 9 o'clock, we've promised to let the senator get out, so I'm going to ask folks to stay seated when we transition to the panel. If you will capture Elizabeth's eye with the microphone, we will go ahead and get some questions. And let me also please remind audience members, let folks know who you are, where you're from, and please actually ask a question.
Jennifer Mizrahi from Respectability. I wanted to ask about justice-involved youth with disabilities and the new work being done to make sure that those disabilities are getting diagnosed through this and that the schools get their IEPs, and how the new Supreme Court case might impact justice-involved youth with disabilities and their abilities to complete high school.
I don't have any idea about that. Maybe you could tell me. You mean the new Supreme Court case? What is that about?
Well, you know what? We'll do this offline. Next question. Lindsay.
So with the return of control to states and local school districts, majority for education, what do you think the Department of Education's role should be in monitoring and enforcing the law? And if states don't want to follow aspects of the law, should the Department of Ed approve their state plans or issue waivers to allow them to do what they want?
Well, my initial reaction is, one, the department's role should be cheerleader. The consumer report for good schools and bad schools. I know when we worked on teacher evaluation in Tennessee in the 80s, President Reagan came down and said it was good, but he didn't bring any money and he didn't tell us we had to do it, but he helped pass it. And Bill Bennett used to go around talking about which schools were good and which schools were bad. The Nation at Risk had a profound impact on American education, and it didn't require anybody to do anything. So I think the chief role of the U.S. Department of Education Secretary is as a consumer report, as an advocate for what we see and for changes and for improvements and highlighting those people who are innovating and bringing them together. As far as states following the law, we worked pretty hard to come to a consensus about what the law should be, and one reason I objected to the accountability regulation was because it didn't follow the law. So my initial reaction was states should follow the law.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Good morning, Senator Alexander. One of the great privileges of my life, I'm Barry Stern, by the way. I work as an education and workforce development consultant currently. But one of the great privileges of my life was to serve you and your team with David Kearns when you were Secretary of Education. Mm-hmm. And as one who's read many, many state plans, I'm wondering why we're still doing that. No kid ever got educated by a plan or by a standard, for that matter. They got educated by a great teacher with a great principal and a great curriculum and openness to parents and so forth.
What's the question, Barry?
So my question is, why do we still have state plans for ESEA, for Perkins, for all these various education laws? I don't think they've contributed myself much to the debate.
Cool.
But
Well, I think the short answer is, Barry, that I fundamentally agree with you, and we've greatly increased the flexibility states have in getting the federal dollars, but the federal government's going to give money to states and going to have certain standards or guardrails, some requirements like the tests. There probably has to be a plan to at least let the federal government know that that's been done. Now, the Secretary doesn't have to approve the plan now. There just has to be one.
Okay. Elizabeth? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Li Yang. I think the most urgent issue in our country is justice and fairness. So I think, can you walk through the educational system that will allow teachers and students or even faculty to learn more about the fairness and justice and reduce the unnecessary administrative staff?
Okay. So what's the question?
My question is, can you do something to improve the justice and fairness concept so people have a righteous to do things right rather than waste resources?
Okay. All right, thank you.
I think it's difficult to legislate. Well, first we have our civil rights laws, which we've had for some time, and they're a foundation of the federal government. Those are based upon justice and fairness. But much beyond that, I think it's hard to legislate justice and fairness. We can advocate it, call attention to it, practice it in our lives, focus on states and teachers and school boards that encourage that. Title I money could be used by states to have programs that encourage that. So those would be my suggestions.
All right, it is 9 o'clock. I think we promised to let you get out of here, Senator.
Thanks,
Thank you
Rick.
so much for taking the time to join us.
Congratulations on your book.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Max, you guys want to come on up?
Great. So thank you guys again so much for coming. I'm Max Eden. I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, formerly of AEI, and co-editor with Rick Hess of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is, last time I checked, #1 on Amazon for new releases in federal education policy. They have really great categories there. I love it. We have a really great panel. I'm very excited to have them all speak, ask them a few questions, let you guys ask them some questions. So I'll just give them a quick introduction and let's get to it. So first we have Allison Klein, who is the politics reporter at Politics K-12, which, to turn a few phrases from our president, is a source of real news about education. Allison is a very fair and highly talented reporter, and very much looking forward to her chatting. Charlie Barone has had the kind of career that I think generations of young people dream about having in DC in education, politics, and policy. He was lead negotiator for the Democratic Party on No Child Left Behind, was very influential in the early stages of the Obama administration, and is executive director of Democrats for Education Reform. Michael Casserly has spent decades at the intersection of policy and urban schools as executive director of the Council of Great City Schools. He's probably forgotten more about urban education policy this morning than I'm likely to learn this year, so looking forward to his perspective. And finally, we have Gerard Robinson, my former colleague and a man who's worn a lot of hats, as state chief of Florida and Virginia, as president of the Black Alliance for Educational Options, as a scholar here at AEI. So really great group, really excited to have them with us. And quick housekeeping note, we are going to be taking questions from our online audience today. If you're watching online and you'd like to submit a question, please go to slido.com, SLIDO.com, enter code AEI event, enter your name, type in your question, and I might read it on stage. So thank you so much. And Allison, we'd love to hear from you first. We heard about the rise and fall of the National School Board. We've also kind of perhaps seen a rise and fall in a federal bipartisan education consensus. At the beginning of your chapter, you noted that President Obama called this a Christmas miracle. At the end of your chapter, in a perhaps slight understatement, you mentioned that perhaps these debates would still persist. So I'd love to hear about how it came together and where you see it going in the near future.
So I should say that I finished my chapter right before Memorial Day last year, when it seemed like the biggest controversy going forward with ESSA was going to be the supplement not supplant rules. Obviously, we've seen even more drama with the Trump administration coming into office, and as many of you, as probably almost everyone here knows, the striking down of the accountability rules for ESSA through the Congressional Review Act. And if you listen to that debate, you would never know that this same committee, the same Congress, had passed ESSA on bipartisan lines. So certainly, there would be plenty for me to write about, I'm guessing, going forward. I will say, and I'm sure some of the other folks on this panel can get more into detail on this. In general, the folks who wrote ESSA seem to agree on a big direction for the law, which was, less federal involvement with some guardrails. But when it came down to the nitty-gritty details, there were a lot of pieces of the law where if you talk to an aide for Senator Alexander and an aide for, say, Representative Bobby Scott, they'll give you different interpretations of the same provisions. So we're about to see, because state plans are coming out, exactly how those kind of different interpretations of legislative language translate into state plans and then state plan implementation. So I guess there was a lot of drama and interest when ESSA was wending its way through Congress. You can read about it in the chapter. Senator Alexander did a great job of recapping it. I don't know that I can add to what he said, but I feel like the interesting part is just ahead of us.
Great.
Yeah.
And so Charlie, one theme that came up a lot in the book, and I think we've also seen filtering through the debate, is that ESSA was kind of a Rorschach test. People could look at and see different things. Your chapter was about what actually changed, what didn't. So kind of would love to run through the basics of what stayed the same, what's different, what people might not realize was taken away, wasn't taken away, and how things look right now.
Yeah, I mean, you know, perhaps the biggest debate was around accountability provisions, which encompass assessments, how frequent are they, what grades, what subjects, what do you do with the information, what other kind of information can you use. And as Senator Alexander noted, they made a decision to keep the testing in grades 3 through 8 statewide in math and reading under ESSA as it was at NCLB. So that is an important guardrail that they put in. The twist is there are lots of other indicators that can now be in the mix in state plans, and states are, as Senator Alexander alluded to, arguing about, you know, should testing be, you know, 50.001% of a school's rating, which is allowed under the law. It has to be slightly more than, has to be a majority, or should it be much higher? So we're going to see a lot of different types of plans from states. One thing that's striking to me, just backing up from this specific discussion, is people still care about accountability, and the feds are still making decisions that are accountability decisions, even when they're articulating that they don't want the feds involved in policy. And I think a key example is the Trump budget, where they're defunding teacher training and they're defunding after school because their argument is the evidence says that those programs don't work. And so the very flexibility they're saying they want states and districts to have that they believe in, they're basically indicting, and they're cutting billions in funding based on their determination that those programs aren't working. So it seemed to me something more surgical would be fairer to those who are the good actors on things like ESSA Title II or after school than this sort of draconian cut approach by the administration. So I just want to reframe things a little bit, that in this little bubble, yeah, we're talking about more limited accountability, but in reality, the feds make decisions, and they make decisions through an accountability mindset in ways that we don't think about necessarily as accountability, but they still have repercussions for schools. So this has been striking to me in the last couple of weeks, to see the arguments on the budget cuts be evidence-based, even though this is an administration that says they believe in local control and they think accountability should be done at the state and local level.
Michael, a lot of times when we talk about federal education policy, we focus kind of exclusively on the feds and the states, but all of your work has been on great cities, and learned from your chapter that it can kind of look a little bit different. The federal-state relationship can look different from major urban areas. We'd love to hear you kind of give the audience an overview of that.
Yeah, unlike a lot of organizations, the city school systems and the Council of the Great City Schools in particular was decidedly ambivalent as the reauthorization was approaching for the umpteenth time in 2015. And if you remember, back in 2013, 14 or so, I think almost every education group in town was arguing for setting NTLB aside and granting more flexibility to the states. And you saw that in lots of joint press conferences and press releases and joint meetings and all of that. We were on none of those, in part because we were very uncertain about where the new reauthorization was going to take us. Now, you have to remember, or people have to remember, that back in 2001, we were actually the only one of the national education organizations that supported No Child Left Behind. We did so because of its emphasis on academic performance and closing achievement gaps and being accountable for results and all of that. Now, we saw the same flaws in No Child Left Behind that everybody else saw, but we didn't think that hiding behind those flaws was what the public was going to want from urban public education. So we thought it was important for us to step up to the plate and be in favor of a law that the public understood to be about results for kids. At the same time, by the time the Obama administration came along, the inevitable flaws in NCLB kind of caught up with it, and we were as eager as anybody else to see the waiver provisions, and we helped work on some of those provisions, in part because some of what the Obama administration was proposing was akin to and compatible with many of the reforms that urban school systems were pursuing. So as we went into the reauthorization in 2015, our choice was between NCLB with waivers and uncertainty. We were able to make NCLB with waivers work for us, but it was pretty clear to us that we had a fair amount to lose under a new reauthorization, and two items in particular were kind of existential problems for us. One was the possibility that the financial architecture of ESEA could be undone, and you saw proposals around portability and the Title I formula and supplements of plant and maintenance of effort, comparability, and all kinds of things that kind of defined that financial architecture. And when we added it all up, it looked to us like we stood to lose upwards of $1 billion in federal aid, which was no small thing for us. The second kind of existential threat is what you're asking about, and that is the states. Historically, as probably everybody knows, there's always been a kind of fractured, uncertain relationship between cities and states. And it's not just city school districts, it's cities in general and their respective states. So the possibility of losing lots of money and being more at the mercy of state bodies that didn't necessarily treat us so well historically presented us with some real ambivalence about whether or not we ought to aggressively pursue a reauthorization. Now, ultimately, I think we came to the conclusion that the financial architecture was enough in place. We started to have conversations with the states about how it is we could work together on their plans and the like, and that's an ongoing process. So while we still feel some uncertainty about how the relationship between cities and states will play out over the long run, I think we felt comfortable enough supporting the law and taking our chances with our new budding partnership with states to give this a go.
Okay, thank you. So just kind of, I'll ask these guys a few questions, and then we'll open it up so the audience can and folks online can. Kind of, my first question to you first, Allison, and then to the rest of the panel is Senator Alexander brought up the accountability regulations, the Congressional Review Act on it, slightly unprecedented thing, at least so far as DC lawmaking, regulation, Congress goes. Would love to hear you, kind of give the audience the lay of the land on that, and then I'd like to ask a few questions to you guys as to how it looks on the ground. So just kind of, what was it about? What was the takeaway from it? What do you think actually might have changed, might not have changed through it? Why did it happen?
So I think it happened, Senator Alexander, who just left, would have been a better person to ask this question too, but I think it happened because Senator Alexander felt that the Obama administration had gone too far in writing some of their regulations on accountability. And there were already all of these really bitter feelings over this fight over supplement, not supplant, and I really feel like, I think if I had asked him about it, he would have said he felt somewhat disrespected by what the Obama administration, and Lindsay, who is his aide, is nodding in the front row, so that sounds right. That he felt somewhat disrespected by what happened with supplement, not supplant. When I've talked to folks who worked in the Obama administration, what they tell me is, this law was ambiguous. We wanted to really make sure those guardrails were strong. That was our priority. Their original accountability rules and this gets wonky, for ESSA really went almost as far as you could on things like opt-outs, making sure that states really, came down hard on schools with high opt-out rates. They arguably went really far when it came to labeling schools. They said you had to come up with an overall summative rating. But then the Obama administration kind of took criticism. They heard from a lot of groups, and they scaled back many of those provisions. If you ask them, they would tell you they feel like they got to a really good and fair place. Some groups, like the Council of the Chief State School Officers, said, we're cool with these rules, we think they're okay. But Republicans in Congress felt differently, and so that's why we saw this big, this unprecedented action, as Max said, with the Congressional Review Act. And the Obama administration knew that their rules for supplement, not supplant would have been subject to the same fate. So I think it was the last day they were in office, yes, they decided not to go through with them. So, obviously that was a lot of drama over regulations, right, for an education law. I mean, we had, I've never seen that much, floor time, I guess, on devoted to things like summative ratings and things like that. So it was interesting and fun for me to cover. Some states would say this does not matter to them. It doesn't hurt them in terms of their clarity. They have a path. They've been working on these rules for a year now, and nothing the Obama administration or the Trump administration or anyone could do is going to divert them from their goal. Certainly there are civil rights groups out there who feel like they don't have, I guess they just don't have as many arrows in their quiver to point at states and school districts that they feel aren't doing the right thing. So, it'll like I said, the interesting part is sort of just beginning when these state plans, when ESSA implementation really rolls out in states and districts, and we'll see what ends up happening if we see this flood of innovation, or if, as some folks are worried about, we see declines in student achievement, especially for historically disadvantaged groups of kids.
So, Gerard, there's been a lot kind of on the table: state policy, federal regulation. You've worn a lot of hats, doing a lot of organizing at Until Behind, leading states under waivers, being in DC and watching this whole debate unfold. What's kind of struck you in broad brushstrokes about the conversational law, the regulations around the law, the way that may or may not be filtering back down to kind of state policies, initiatives that you, not too long ago, were leading yourself?
December 2015, I published a piece here at AEI congratulating both sides of the House for actually passing the ESSA. Now remember, for 8 years, we had done little to actually get that done. It was called a Christmas miracle. And if you were to look back today, some would say, wow, what happened in a matter of a year and a half? So from that standpoint, that was great. I think from a state chief or state leader standpoint, I think this is one of the best times in American history to be a state chief, because you're now given certain levels of authority and flexibility that we haven't had. I had a chance to lead Florida's waiver for No Child Left Behind. And if I were sitting in that seat today, there are definitely things about high school graduation rates and others I could have done differently because it was put in my lap. So I think that's a great point. But you know who else is going to benefit from this law? It's going to be consultants. It's going to be, there's a little laughter as the consultants in there are getting excited about this. And it's also advocacy groups. The state departments of education, school boards hire consultants, annually to do work that simply we don't have the human or technological capacity to do so. It's not a bad thing. We could just ship it out. And so now that you have a brand new law, people can come in and help us think very differently. But this is also a great time for advocates. Now remember, if in fact we're saying this is something we want states to do, by the time Obama was elected, inaugurated 2009 to the present, a number of states passed a number of laws, both public and private school choice laws, that are in place that this administration supports. They've been more on the, they've got more skin in the game at this at the state level, who can actually help the feds think about it. So this is a new day in American education, and despite all the hyper-partisanship that's taking place, which is part of American politics, I think this is a good time for young people to look at civics and incivility.
Michael, you talked a lot about the lead up to it and the way the organization viewed that. What's struck you over the past year as things have unfolded? Are these debates in DC really filtering down to the big cities? What's worrying? What's exciting?
Yeah, they are filtering down to the local level, at least in the cities. I have to say that on the ground, at least in the places that I work, what they're really focused on more is trying to raise academic performance. ESEA, including this new law, as much of a compromise and as civil as it largely was in its development, is still, like any piece of federal legislation, a compliance instrument. School districts are going about the process with their states of trying to figure out how to best comply with the law, but at the same time, they're working on a whole series of other things that are really kind of outside the whole compliance framework. I would like to pick up on your question about the regulations. And this last reauthorization was my 7th complete reauthorization that I've gone through since the mid-1970s. And there actually were regulatory fights that were similar.
I only go back to 2006, so.
Yeah, that were similar. On the other hand, this one was a particularly bloody set of fights, particularly in negotiated rulemaking. And I think a lot of us ultimately could have made the assessment rules work, and probably some of the accountability rules work, although the ELL component of the regulations and certainly the supplements of plant were largely unworkable proposals that the administration had made. But I think what made the situation worse was how the negotiated rulemaking was actually pursued, kind of split the organizations needlessly and pitted the practitioner community against the civil rights community in ways that were really counterproductive and needless. There were lots of different ways in which people could have been brought together, but they weren't. And I rather think that they weren't almost deliberately. I don't really say that lightly, but I do think it has to be part of the calculus that the administration used in ultimately pulling back the supplements plant regulations on the last day of the administration. Now, we ended up supporting the rollback of the regulations, and we supported the application of the Congressional Review Act on pulling those regulations back, not so much because we thought it was overreach. Every administration overreaches to some extent, and frankly, everybody tries to tell us what to do, so we're kind of used to it. On the other hand, I think one thing that Senator Alexander said was something that was really important to us, and that is the integrity that went behind the compromises in the ESSA were important. They were important because they were civilly derived, the compromises were honest, there was real integrity behind it. We rather thought that the Obama administration's regulating was in violation of that spirit of compromise, even in places where we might have liked the regulation, but it went beyond what the law said. It seemed to us to be just a violation of the trust that people had built, even in places where there was disagreement. And we thought there was a certain upending of that trust in the regulations writing process. So we were in favor of rolling them back and just starting the process all over again.
Yeah. So there's, as wonky and niche as this is, there are a lot of kind of interesting concepts and stable relationship between the legislature and the executive, the federal government, the states. Charlie, your opening comments were pretty interesting in terms of a different lens of viewing federal-state relationships, what is and what isn't accountability. I'd love to hear you reflect either directly on the regulations or taking a step back on the course of things. Are you heartened by recent developments, disheartened by them?
My attitude is it is what it is. We got to where we got because of the history and where things are. Very quickly on the regulations, at the end of the day, and I think both Mike and Allison made this point, the earlier draft regulations did have some license in them with regard to the statute, but the ones that got repealed under CRA, they were pretty close to the statute. I mean, there wasn't a lot of daylight, in my opinion, between those and the statute. And I do think a lot of it was the buildup of bad will because of the way the Obama administration wrote the regs without really, it seems to me, including Republican members of Congress. Now, there may be strategic reasons they did that. I won't get into those, but that's probably true. I mean, I think one of the most interesting dynamics has been the involvement of civil rights and business and disability groups in accountability policy and how that's grown over time. And one of the things we've talked about here is it took a long time to reauthorize ESSA this time, longer than it's ever taken before by far. And I think one of the dynamics was that beginning in like 2008, where there was a move by the Democratic Congress to just suspend NCLB until reauthorization, they thought that was going to be a slam dunk. The Democrats in Congress who were pushing that thought that was going to be an easy vote that they could get, that they could put this up. Everybody hated NCLB. We'll suspend it, we'll get a vote, and then everybody will have the relief they want from what they saw as an onerous law. But it was not a slam dunk. And civil rights groups and disability groups and business groups came in and said, you know what, we like a lot of what this law has been doing for us on the ground. I mean, even in the disability community, you would think that with an IEP, directing what kind of services your child gets and the type of instruction that they're going to get, that would be plenty for somebody. Well, even advocates for students with disabilities were finding that an outcome-based system of accountability where you looked at how students were doing, that except for the most, severely cognitively disabled kids that you would expect everybody to meet a certain standard, that was able to leverage a lot at the state and local level. And I think each successive iteration of an attempt to reauthorize the law in 2007, 2008, 2011, 2013, they kept coming around to this political reality. I don't think it's until Patty Murray became the ranking Democrat that political reality was recognized. And now we're seeing that start to happen out in the states, where we're seeing similar coalitions to the ones that worked in DC come around the accountability and assessment issue in California and Louisiana, in New York, and in other places. And so that's a dynamic for us, I think, for everybody to watch. Even if the feds aren't going to be on top of this, lots of people out in the states and localities are going to be on top of this. So when Gerard says this is going to be a good law for advocates, I think he's right, because there's going to be a lot to dig into and a lot for them to pay attention to. And prior to this, they really haven't had to pay a lot of attention because everything was sort of dictated from the federal level, and now that's been opened up and states have to own these systems. So it's going to be an interesting time. And for the political folks and the wonky folks both, I think there's dynamics here that are going to be interesting to watch.
Gerard?
So Mike Castor makes a good point about him having participated in a number of reauthorizations and the fact that the fights then mirrored the fights today. But I would say even go back further. Jack Jennings, who many of you in here know, had a chance to write a book review about his book. I think it was Presidents, Congress, and School Reform. And he really did a deep dive into the politics that went into passing the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And I would go back and not only read that book, but go back and read the congressional documents and the fights, particularly the role that a congressman named Augustus Hawkins from Los Angeles played in that debate. Because what you'll see across space and time, issues of civil rights would come up. Issues, special needs, although they were called something differently at that time. So there's a lot of nuances here, and because we have a new law, I think we should also refresh our memory on what took place in the 60s to understand what's taking place today.
Yeah, to that point, Charlie, in his chapter, talks a lot about the kind of similarities between ESSA and the '94 Act, but many of the provisions in the '94 Act, you see the first throes of some of those provisions in the '88 Act when Gus Hawkins was chair of the committee.
So another follow-up question kind of to the themes of protection, the role of federal government. This is a theme from your chapter, Michael, your chapter as well, Charlie. Something that I think has gone somewhat underappreciated in ESSA is the additional reporting requirements and the transition and paradigm between let's make sure that these schools are doing the right things for these kids to let's just make sure that the schools are reporting and we can leave the rest up to the advocates, to the local activists, to the cities. So Michael, I'd love to hear you talk about what that looks like from a district perspective to have these new requirements. Is it burdensome? Is it exciting? What kind of dynamics will it engender once all this information is out there that didn't previously used to be?
More paperwork, exciting? No, I don't think so. Is it going to be a burden? Yes, absolutely. There's a lot more reporting requirements in the new act than we have ever seen before. A lot more disaggregation of data, a lot more variables, a lot more things that you have to cross in your data collection than ever before. Matter of fact, it makes NCLB pale in comparison in terms of the reporting requirements. And frankly, it was one of the reasons why we didn't necessarily need to see the regulations or the draft regulations under the previous administration bear down even harder on some of those, because the law itself was pretty expansive in the new reporting requirements. Mostly our data systems in most of the big cities are pretty adept. They're going to be able to produce most of that data. It is going to take a considerable amount of person hours to make sure that all of that data is accurate and the like. I do suspect that some of the data will start laying the groundwork for future reauthorizations, and you may see not necessarily a swing back in the other direction, but I think you'll see the advocacy groups pushing for more kind of federal prescriptiveness because of the data that will be reported as a result of the new law.
Allison?
Oh, well, as a reporter, we are really excited about the data. We can't wait to dig into it. I will say I do wonder how accessible it will be.
Some people are excited.
Yeah, we're excited. I do wonder how accessible, though, it'll end up being. Sometimes when I'm looking at, school report cards, I mean, my eyes glaze over. I end up, spending just an inordinate amount of time on, websites of really high-performing, fantastic school districts that are your members, just trying to compare one school to another. And I hope that it will all be very transparent and easy to digest for reporters and also for parents.
Yeah, I think some of this is likely to depend a little bit on the new administration and how transparent they make that data. I think it remains to be seen, just how aggressive they're going to be in pursuing those reporting requirements, and then how transparent they are and how high quality they try to ensure the data are. I think that's still an open question.
Yeah, I mean, even under the old law, there's fairly in NCLB, there was fairly boilerplate language around transparency of report cards and the information having to be in one place and be intelligible. That's something that was never really enforced. And I don't know that it'll be any more enforced this time. You don't have to enumerate all the reporting you're going to do in compliance with the new law in your consolidated state plan. That's not something that's required in the application. So states are able to be silent on this for now, and then people are just gonna have to keep an eye out for states reporting the information that they're supposed to at some point in the future. And yeah, I totally agree with Mike. It'll be really interesting to see whether this administration, whether that's something that they care about or not.
Gerard, do you want to venture any predictions as to the extent to which these states will own these systems, the extent to which it'll benefit or not be able to be read by local activists and civil rights organizations?
So Because I'm going to play a role in actually having to review some of those state actions, I should probably not weigh in early and tip my hat. But what I will say is freedom isn't free. And I want to say that, and not lightly, because we're giving people an opportunity to do something radically different and then expecting them to do that overnight. We're giving you freedom. You're free. Are you? Because with freedom also becomes responsibility. And how much do we really expect there to be less federal control? When you have more paperwork in this law than you did before, that's another way of federal involvement in education. Also remember that, the senator gave a very good history lesson on the federal law. In every new reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, or ESSA, sorry, there was language in there, prohibition on federal control of education. Every single one. You may have a few words would change here and there. And yet you've seen regulations increase, you've seen the amount of paperwork increase, and that's with the same law. So from my standpoint, I'm one of the few people I think swimming in what I call the pool for curmudgeons when it comes to the ability to think that there would be no federal control or less. The paperwork points in a different direction, the history of how we operate, and be real clear. When you give billions of dollars to states, you've got billions of things to say.
Yeah, could I pick up on one thing that Gerald made reference to, and also Senator Alexander made reference to, and that is now that we're free. The senator this morning mentioned that after the 81 reauthorization with Reagan, that it unleashed untold innovation in education. I was there too, and I don't recall a flood of innovation occurring. And as I read the new draft state plans, I am not seeing innovation unleashed. Matter of fact, I'm seeing very much the same kinds of practice and plans that you saw under the old act, but with maybe not quite so much detail to it. I think to your point, I think you're absolutely right that if there is freedom in innovation to be had here, it's going to take some time because people are really very used to working in straitjackets here, and it's going to take a while for them to realize that you can do some things that you hadn't otherwise been able to do.
Charlie, I'd love to hear you reflect on, are we likely to see more innovation, more inertia, heterogeneous mix of both?
I mean, I'm mostly seeing what Mike is seeing. I think the parameters of what most states are looking at looks in some ways a lot like what people are doing now. I don't know how you can, it's a hard thing to spur from the federal level, I think, innovation. I mean, I think the Obama administration tried and had some success in some areas, and in others, not so much. I mean, I think one of the problems is under the guise of innovation, you have a lot of different forces at work. So some people, there's here inside the Beltway in states and districts, there's a contingent of folks who just don't want to use academic data in any way to track kids or rate schools. And whether it's at the federal level or the state level or the local level, they don't believe in it for whatever reason. They don't think that kids can overcome their circumstances, their demographic circumstances. They think it's too narrow. They don't want the pressure that comes with an indicator where you have a clear outcome that's differentiable, where there's actually, people score at 0 and people score at 100. And so some, under the guise of innovation, are pushing things just to lower the weight of the academic factors, and they'll send you whatever you're willing to accept in that basket, they'll take it. So, the debate here around the DC plan last week, it was the plan that OSSE had, and then the opponents of the OSSE plan didn't have their own plan. They didn't say, this is the way we'd like to do it. Here's an innovative plan. They just kept throwing things at the OSSE plan. because they're trying to negotiate. So, and then there's a lot of folks who really are doing innovative things and have a hard time, getting grounded in a school system or spreading their model. So I think it's very, 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 very difficult. I mean, I think one thing, if people believe that a high quality charter can do a lot of good things for kids, in part because they have autonomy to innovate, maybe we shouldn't be so hung up on what a school's called and try to get more public schools with some level of autonomy like charters have. And don't get beyond this charter debate about what type of school it is and just give them a little more autonomy. I don't know what Mike thinks about that for some of his cities, but I think some principals could move a lot of innovation if they had more freedom to pick their staffs and decide how things worked in their schools and were held accountable for results. It gets you beyond the privatization debate too. So that's a direction I think would be interesting to go. But it's very tough out there. There's lots of people out there doing innovative things, but there's a whole lot of garbage out there too. Allison?
Oh, I think if you talk to some state chiefs, they'll tell you that ESSA is just a teeny piece of their overall school reform picture. So they may be doing a lot of things that could fall under the heading of innovation. They're not necessarily going to put in this kind of wonky technocratic plan for the U.S. Department of Education. Partly because maybe they want to be able to make it work and make it work in their own context first before they go and tell the feds about it, which is an argument that would make sense, I would think, to at least Senator Alexander and some of the Republicans who wrote this law. Another thing that I was thinking is Mike was talking about the level of the plans and the changes in the plans. My editors keep asking me, like, when are we going to see ESSA in classrooms? Like, when can you go out there and show me how ESSA looks different? Show us an NCLB classroom and an ESSA classroom. And I honestly, it's a stumper, right? I have no idea. Any thoughts?
Stop thinking about that.
Okay. Do you have any of your members? Great place to go
There's
and
no
travel
ESSA
to?
classrooms
There's no
and
ESSA classroom. That's what I had.
NCLB classrooms.
I'm glad the answer I'm giving my editors is the right one then. Yeah.
Please tell them that I'm laughing along with you.
Okay.
What about if some state adopts one of these social climate measures as part of their accountability system?
Yeah, we had thought of that.
That seems to be one.
Yeah.
So, as most people know, under the new law, only the test scores have to be a majority. The test scores, the grad rates, the EL measures have to be half of the school rating, but the other half can be whatever you want it to be. And so people are looking at a number of different indicators to slot into that other part. So they may keep the academics at 90. They can slot something like the school climate at 10%. They could slot it in at 45 if they wanted, or 49. There's been a lot of talk at using school climate measures, using something that gauges social and emotional learning. There's a lot of talk about that. I don't know if any state is really close to doing that as part of their plans. But when they do, I think it'll be really interesting to see how that rolls. Is that something that teachers and students feel facilitates better learning and good feedback to teachers about what they're doing in their classrooms and making their classes better? Does it differentiate kids in classrooms in schools, or is it all bunched up at one end the way a lot of measures are, where everybody's doing great? Does it obscure academics in a way where a school gets a really good rating despite having low math and or reading scores because the weighting for something like social climate is really high? So that would be the kind of thing that if the state does it and makes it real, you would look at and see how that's making a difference in the classroom in terms of how people use school ratings and those other things. But we're a ways away from that.
Yeah, I would agree.
I think the real opportunities for innovation are probably in the SIG stuff now that we're away from the four models and the like. Although the state's history with SIG before we made it a secretary's program wasn't particularly inspiring either. And on the accountability side in the ways that Charlie is suggesting. But I would agree with Allison, that there's a whole lot of really interesting innovation going on at the local level, say around curriculum reform, that has nothing to do with ESSA whatsoever, and almost by definition can't have anything to do with the federal government. But it's some of the most dramatic and promising reforms that have portents for academic improvements.
I would say one other thing that's gotten less attention than it probably should are the new set-asides for states in terms of school improvement and personalized learning. So under NCLB, states could set aside 4% for school improvement activities where they would supposedly use that money to help schools improve. I don't think anybody ever really tracked how states spent that 4%, so it was a little bit nebulous. But that's now up to 7% in the law. The states can keep 7%. And there's then there's 3% on top of that for personalized learning that states can do.
So
Optional.
Run this down to, would that actually affect a classroom? Would that create ESSA classrooms? And what's exciting about that exactly?
They're going to have more money. It's a weird setup because the districts are actually on the hook for doing the school turnarounds the first 3 or 4 years, but the states have gotten all the money. So they're going to have to try to finesse that a little bit. And then the 3%, it is optional for personalized learning, but rarely does a state have an opportunity to set money aside and not set that money aside. I think people who've been doing this for a long time know that. So what do they do with the 7 and the 3, I guess? And Mike, you...
The 3% under Title I is a little bit different. I mean, it's got some kind of components of NCLB in it. The 7% is up from 4%, but many states are saying they're taking the 7%, which is mandatory. They're taking the 3%, which is optional, and then they're taking the additional 3% off of Title II. I think what a lot of people don't quite understand is that that comes out of the local allocation. So
there's no hold harmless on the Title I stuff. They can take the money even if it means districts getting less. There's no
that's what I mean, is that the set-asides at the state level come out of the local allocation, which means that local school districts are going to go into the first year of implementation of ESSA with a fair amount of less money. For our districts, it's about $250 million, something like that, if all of the states take their respective set-asides. And a number of states have been pretty clear about saying, we're going to take it even if we don't know for sure yet what we're going to do about it. We're just going to take it. I don't quite know what that's about, because there's nothing that the state can do with that set-aside money that they couldn't do without the set-aside money. It just gives them more funds, but it's at the expense of the local allocations.
Gerard?
So all students in our public schools matter, and this law is going to matter a lot. But 2 places or 2 pools that I'm going to look into regarding innovation is innovation and how it impacts students with special needs and those involved in the juvenile justice system. And sometimes they're one and the same. And I say that because special needs students, for a host of reasons, that population is rising. And school superintendents and state chiefs will tell you, we've got to find ways of making that work. And so when we think of innovation, we think charter, we think private school voucher, we think of a number of things. There should be innovation for that population as well. But also those who are involved in the juvenile justice system, whether they're with our friend DC, who's working in that space now. But there's language in ESSA, or ESSA, excuse me, that focuses on students involved in the criminal justice system. I happen to believe there is a school-to-prison pipeline. Some do not. And there's an opportunity right now to figure out how do we work with them and how do we change that. So those are 2 areas for me where I'd like to see innovation manifest.
I just wanted to make one point on the set-aside. I have no idea how many states are going to end up taking it. I think we'll see when we get a sense of these plans. I do wonder if there are going to be, if Title II goes away, I mean, if you can reserve 3% of nothing, that is not that helpful. And if Title I remains, level funded, or a big piece of it goes to a portability pilot, which is a whole other form of innovation that I know some states and districts will be excited about. Although some might maybe less so, less excited. But if you can do that, if there's less federal funding, I wonder if it'll be less tempting for some of these states to take the set aside. Also, it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that most of the money ends up going back to districts, although maybe not for the purpose that they would have originally wanted to use it for. Like the 3%, it ultimately flows to districts, can be competitive, so some districts will lose out. But
it'll go back to districts in terms of competitive grants, but it won't necessarily go in the same configuration that it went before.
Okay.
So we've kind of last 15, 20 minutes through transition from inertia, things aren't really going to change, just some causes for optimism. Let's kind of maybe put on our Debbie Downer hats here for a second. I think that if we were having this conversation 15 years ago, we would have been excited about No Child Left Behind, this awesome, big, bipartisan step forward that we thought was going to change the way things are written, things are done. 5, 10, 15 years down the line wasn't quite the case. What either political threats, functional threats, cause for alarm do you guys see as ESSA is going to unfold over the next few years?
I mean, the thing I see, and I've seen it for a while, is I see a lot of inertia in terms of, schools feeling like they've got to do a lot to improve the academic achievement, particularly of kids from historically disadvantaged groups. NCLB had a lot of flaws, but for the first 5, 6 years, schools were really pressured to do something. And some schools adapted to that pressure with smart ways of educating kids, and some didn't. Some used things like test prep, which doesn't really help you improve your scores as much as having a decent education does. But still people do it. And then I feel like that urgency dissipated. And I think some people want to recreate that sense of urgency. I don't know if that's possible. That was probably a one-off. And the data will show that nationally there was a bump up in student achievement, particularly in math, but also some in reading. I don't know how to get that same level of urgency reinstated. I think it's very hard to do it. I think any change is hard. So people like us might be up on a stage and we're talking about innovation. You gotta talk to a district leader, they're gonna tell you the host of political reasons that they can't do something that's highly innovative because of the disruption it's gonna cause and all the people that they've gotta negotiate with. And people have been through a slew of different reforms over the last several years. So, like it or not, race to the top, Common Core, new assessments, new charters, choice in a bunch of states, and I think there's some fatigue out there maybe on reform, and so a need to regroup. I think human capital is one place where everybody should be able to agree that if we want people to innovate and we want to give people autonomy and authority, you want them to be prepared for that task. And I just think paying teachers better, training them better, paying them commensurate with that higher level of training would help us avoid all these other things we do to work around some shortcomings in the system now where we're trying to tell people to do what to do. I think if they were better prepared to do their jobs, then they would do those things on their own as their own sort of proactive agents. And to me, over the longer term, I just think that's a better way to go. You won't have to have a level of prescriptiveness if you can trust the people in place to be able to do all the different things, and it's very hard, but to do all the different things that they need to do to educate kids well.
Michael, love to hear.
Yeah, I think this is a really, really critical point because I think Charlie's right that there's been some taking the foot off of the accelerator a little bit in terms of the public pressure that NCLB created. On the other hand, at least for us in urban public education, that pressure has not dissipated at all. I think the pressure on us to improve is as keen as it ever was, No Child Left Behind or not. And it's one of the reasons why the city school systems themselves have kind of created this culture where they're putting a lot of pressure on each other to improve, and why we formulated the Trial Urban District Assessment of NAEP, why we put hundreds of technical assistance teams in the field, why we bear down on our Males of Color initiative, and all kinds of other things, because we understand that the public won't tolerate failure in urban public education in the way that they've understood it in the past. They need to see us improve. So we are trying to do what Charlie is suggesting, and that is to create a mechanism by which we don't necessarily need the federal government or the states to improve. I don't mind the pressure, press on, but we're trying not to wait for somebody to fix us. We're trying to pursue that improvement on our own.
Thank you. And with that, I think we're going to turn to audience Q&A. So if you have a question, catch the eye of Kelsey back there, Grant, and also audience questions or online questions. I will catch from here.
You're reporting on this, and certainly in your chapter in the book, you have had a chance to look at how ESSA came to fruition. Curious, what are one or two things that folks don't understand that have real importance for why the law looks the way it does and how it'll affect implementation going forward?
Oh, that's a great question. I have to actually think about that for a minute. I actually really wonder what would have happened if ESSA had basically been, hadn't happened, right? Like, we would have Betsy DeVos coming in. She's obviously, love her or hate her, she's a controversial education secretary. And we would have still had waivers in place. And so she would have been able to, if she wanted, nothing would have stopped her from giving states waivers in exchange for adopting Title I portability or school choice programs or getting rid of collective bargaining. And you think teachers' unions are upset about her now. I mean, I can only imagine. So I feel like this may have just been the one, and I think that everybody sort of, maybe they didn't see this particular configuration playing out necessarily. And if you read ESSA, it sure seems like they're trying to prevent Ernie Duncan or theoretical Hillary Clinton's education secretary from overstepping their bounds, but I can't stop thinking about that alternate universe, and I think that the people who wrote ESSA, to some extent, were thinking about it too. They really wanted to get it done at this point where they sort of knew the configuration. This was their moment in time, and so I think there was a lot more impetus and interest in compromise than there ever had been for those reasons. The other thing, and this kind of gets back to Max's previous question, I wonder how much the debate over annual standardized testing, that we sort of had like a fake out at the beginning with Senator Alexander saying that maybe he was open to rethinking that, and he pretty quickly said, just kidding, we're sticking with this. Marty West thinks it's a good idea. So I do wonder how much, I think 2015 was the last year that debate was a fake out, could have been a fake out. I think if we had waited for the theoretical never going to happen Clinton administration, or if under this administration even, given some of the secretary's recent comments, I don't know if she's about states deciding how much testing there should be. I do wonder if that debate would become more real. And so the interesting thing to me is sort of what this law would have looked like if it hadn't passed in 2015, which I realize is a complicated answer to your question, but that's what I keep thinking about when I go back and look back at that year.
It is kind of an interesting thought experiment, I have to say, Rick, because a lot of people had argued against the Obama waivers in Allison's first example because there were conditions tied to them, and whether or not that was overstepping the waiver authority of the Department of Education. So it is an interesting thought experiment about whether or not a DeVos Department of Education would put their own conditions on a set of waivers, and how people would have responded at that point.
Yeah, it's a really interesting alternate universe that we're in right now. Yeah.
And so this kind of transitions to almost every single question that I'm getting from online, which is that we have this interesting dynamic where we both have a reduced federal role, a secretary who seems to be committed to a light federal footprint, but also a secretary who is a big proponent of school choice. So I'd love to hear people's reflections, and everything's still kind of up in the air as regards to what will and won't happen from the federal level on school choice. What can we imagine happening? How do we see it maybe playing out? Love to hear anything about the tensions there.
I think one thing that's underreported is getting a voucher plan approved by Congress is really hard, and there are a number of Republicans who will vote against it and have voted against it. So on ESSA in the Senate, there were a couple of voucher/portability amendments. Those failed, with every Democrat voting against them and 8 Republicans voting against both of them. There's even a smaller margin now between Democrats and Republicans. So the amendment on the House side was a little more extreme. It was really about making Title I drastically portable, but that also failed. And there were a lot of Republicans that voted against that. But my experience is the votes aren't there. I just think, I don't think this administration has a clear message. Again, like I started out saying, they're cutting programs based on the argument that these programs haven't been effective. So they're applying their own system of accountability to federal programs to make cuts to those programs. But at the same time, they're saying federal government should hold folks accountable who get federal funding. And to me, I'd rather say, listen, if I do a good job, can I get the money and not have my money cut because someone else is doing a bad job? That's the deal I would want. So to me, they don't have their story straight. And I just think, regardless of what you think about choice, the quality is really uneven out there. And there are other problems. I mean, do you want to move to a system where people get a coupon to go get their education and they come up with the extra money? We've seen this on the healthcare debate. Whatever the government is providing, the conservatives want the government to provide less. So you have parents out there would love to take $5,000 and buy their own scholarship program, but at the same time, you wonder for a system of public education where that goes, to where you only get a subsidy. So I don't know how far they can get. Even Rick and I were talking beforehand. There was a piece Lauren Kammerer did in U.S. News a few days ago. Rick's skeptical of doing private school choice through the feds. Heralded is skeptical. Cato is skeptical. They don't really want the feds involved because they don't want the kind of problems that might crop up if federal money started flowing to these things and then people paid them more scrutiny and started picking at some of the problems. Conservatives think that might be more problematic than it's worth. So, and you know where the Democrats are. So it's complicated, and she's got a tough road ahead to get some of the things done that she wants to get done.
So you raised the question before, 15 years ahead, what's going to be ESSA and what we look at. And a lot of it's going to be debated on how we actually define choice. Because when you hear the term choice, you automatically think voucher, when in fact we already have choice in public education. You've had magnet schools long before you had charter schools. That's choice. You have inter-district choice, intra-district choice. And there's funds in place to support those type of things. And so if we're looking at innovation, let's not just think on the private school side. There's a lot we can do within the public school side. But it's also worth noting that the largest voucher program in the country isn't going to be a voucher program coming from the Department of Education. It's actually Section 8 housing vouchers, which actually educate poor families whose kids could actually benefit from this. We don't mind spending money on poor families to have options to pick different types of housing, but somehow we become delirious. We want to give the same options to those parents for their kids to go to private schools.
Yeah, I don't have any crystal ball here on choice issues. I tend to agree with Charlie, having seen and participated in a lot of those votes over a very long period of time. Typically, the votes aren't there to get it all the way through in the way that it's been proposed. And to my conservative friends, I'd say be careful what you ask for. because you might get it.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Maddie Shaw. I'm actually a student at GW, so I'm going to try and weigh in here, but please let me know if I'm way off the mark. Mike and Charlie, you both spoke about sort of this sense of fatigue with reform in education right now, and I wanted to ask you how we can balance continuing reform while letting laws and regulations actually go into effect and making sure that we're not just jumping the gun and saying, oh, it didn't work the first day it was rolled out, so we need to do something else, and how we can kind of balance that. And anyone else, please weigh in as well. Thanks.
I mean, the federal role is actually pretty minimal right now. You have to give a certain number of tests in different grades. You have to disaggregate that data. You have to rate schools. You have to intervene in the bottom 5% of schools in the state and dropout factories with graduation rates below 67%, with graduate rates below 67%, and then some other subset of schools where historically disadvantaged groups aren't doing well. So most of the inputs, the operational things, they're all really up to states and districts to take on themselves. And so I still think there's a lot of flexibility to do that, and I'm probably underselling the efforts of some of Mike's members who are out there trying hard on this stuff all the time. It's just, when you look at certain places, there's definitely more that could be done, and I think there needs to be more localized advocacy where people advocate in systems, because a lot of the things we're talking about here are not going to work in different kinds of places. I'm from New Jersey, and there's a lot of small school districts, a lot of single school districts, and doing choice there is incredibly problematic, even if you believed in it, because everybody has a little fiefdom of their district. And so you're not going to, if there's one school that all the kids go to set up one other school is a big problem. But there are things you can do in those districts that aren't being done. I think it's because people who advocate at the state level have their hands full with other things. I think more people need to be brought in, and that's what I was alluding to earlier. I think that is happening, with civil rights and disability groups and business groups being more involved at the state and local level now because they have to be. Some good things could come out of that.
Yeah, I do think that a certain amount of reform exhaustion has set in, and maybe it's not a bad thing to have people pause a little bit and try to synthesize what they've learned from all the reforms that people have tried to pursue over the last 15 or so years. But even though that there is a certain amount of reform exhaustion, what has not dissipated is the pressure to improve. And I think as much as people are tired and need a little bit of space to try to think about why some things work and why some things didn't, that pressure is actually helpful and useful as a way of making sure that people don't go to sleep for a long time. They just take a quick nap and get back to it. So there is exhaustion, but I don't know that there's diminution of will.
We have time for probably about 2 more questions. Yes, ma'am? Just one moment.
So the Supreme Court ruled 8-0 that students with disabilities can no longer just be babysat. They're supposed to have advancement in their educational outcomes. So I'm wondering, given this brand new Supreme Court ruling and this new law, how you think the new law will change things based on the Supreme Court decision for either educational attainment or trade school vocational attainment for students with disabilities.
So this is the Andrew F. case? Is that what you're referring to? Yeah. So I don't know whether Congress is likely to go back and revisit IDEA or not. I think there's been some overstatement about what the court did and what they didn't do in that case. And it may suggest that the Congress doesn't go back and revisit the law. I mean, the Supreme Court was very clear in indicating that a de minimis standard was not what the Raleigh case was really about. But on the other hand, the Supreme Court did not set a bright line standard by which that defined what a new kind of threshold of performance needed to be. So I don't, because so much of Raleigh was actually affirmed, I'm not sure that Congress is necessarily going to rush to revisit IDEA just because of what the court decided. That's, I don't know that for sure, but.
I would just expect that it'll bring extra scrutiny to that portion of states, not just plans, but ESSA implementation. As you probably know, parents of kids with disabilities are some of the best organized, most informed advocates out there. And I think that this Supreme Court ruling, at least when it comes to ESSA implementation, obviously this law was written before this court ruling came down. This is another, basically tool in their tool shed to hold states, to make sure that states, districts, and individual schools and even individual teachers are, doing what they're supposed to do.
I mean, one thing that happened in NCLB via a reg, which I'm sure you know, is there was a cap put on the percentage of students that could be given an alternate test tied to alternate, i.e. lower standards. In ESSA, there's a strict 1% cap. Statewide, which is 1% of all students, so about 10% of students with disabilities, and that's something the disability community fought hard for, and I think people are going to monitor and implementation, but it's consistent with the theme, and Mike, I think, knows this decision better than I do, but it seems to be consistent with the theme of the ruling that kids should be held to a high academic standard in terms of the work expected for them in school.
When I mentioned earlier about my uncertainty about kind of the new state authority and new decision-making powers by the states, this situation that Charlie referenced is a good example of the possibility of clumsiness in state implementation of this, because while there's a 1% cap on identification for the most severely disabled, no individual school district can have a 1% cap. So it's hard to imagine how the states are actually going to implement this if they can't cap the individual districts, nor does the state have any role in the actual formation of the IEPs and the placement decisions and identification decisions. So it's this is one of those cases where the law is a little bit at odds with itself, and the states are going to have to try to figure out two contradictory provisions here that I suspect the advocates are going to be right in the middle of.
And actually, not to get even wonkier, but the one of the few sets of regulations that was not CRA that's still in the books does deal with this cap. They were assessment regulations written by a negotiated rulemaking committee. I can tell everybody's eyes are glazing over, but they make this.
The assessment.
Yeah, the assessment reg. So they basically made this waiver. They kept this 1% cap in place. There's a waiver allowance in the law for states to get a waiver from the 1% cap, and those regs make it really hard for you to get that waiver. So those regs, which are still in the books, still a thing, make it clear that states are supposed to take that 1% requirement seriously. So we'll see what happens.
We have time for one more question from the audience. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Todd Wiggins, good morning. I just wanted to know if you have any perspective on the district. There's a lot has been said in the last three mayoral administrations about school reform here, and if any of these topics are germane to people that send their kids to school here.
Seems like
The District of Columbia schools?
Yeah.
I have to say that my sense of optimism for the DC public schools has never been higher. And I give a lot of credit to the last several mayors. Initially, I was not in favor of mayoral control of the DC schools, but through the last three chancellors, Michelle and Kaya and now Antoine, and the emphasis they've been putting on academic improvement in their reforms, I think has made a real difference in that school district. One of the analyses, one of the things we're doing right now is an analysis on why and how some urban school districts manage to overcome the effects of poverty in raising academic performance. And one of the things in our analysis that we're showing, at least preliminarily, is that the DC schools over the last several administrations of NAEP, being part of the TUDA program, they just made extraordinary improvements. Now, I think their lowest performing groups still need additional work. They're not moving quite as fast as the other groups, but my sense of optimism about the nature of the reforms and the continuity of those reforms, and then the expertise and the thinking that's going on underneath those reforms, I think is really, really encouraging and is something that other big city school districts across the country are looking at very closely.
I'm equally excited about DC public schools, in part because I worked for DC public schools in the late 1990s when Arlene Ackerman was superintendent of schools during the, I guess, the middle stages of the Federal Control Board takeover. And DC public schools looked radically different. The achievement rate, the dropout rate was just horrible. So things are moving in the right direction. I think with this administration, you're going to see a push not only for the traditional public schools, but the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program will benefit from this, as well as the charter schools. But DC is also a very good marketplace to look at the future of big city schools, urban schools, in part because of the role of gentrification. And what does that mean in fundamentally changing not only the demographic, but the economic makeup of cities, and what does that mean for public schools?
It's a big question to end on, and I think kind of taking it from high level in DC to what's going on the ground. So I just want to thank all the panelists so much for their thoughtful comments. It's been really great. And thank you all for coming today. What's up? All right, great. Well, thank you guys so much.
Okay.
Good job moderating.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're a natural.
Yeah, you really are.